A rainy morning, the upscale cafe was packed with customers. A man wiped tables, his back slightly hunched, his apron faded from years of washing. A young woman, CEO of an investment firm, sat at table 7, signing a contract. As she reached to sign, he suddenly stepped forward and knocked the coffee across the table. "Are you insane?" she shouted, jumping to her feet. The entire cafe fell silent. He didn't explain himself. He just pulled out paper towels and wiped the corner of the table, where an electrical outlet had just sparked. He said quietly, "The socket was shorting out. If I hadn't done that, you would have been electrocuted." She froze, staring at the small burn mark on his wrist, and no one knew that this woman was the one who had cost him everything. Daniel Hayes was 38 years old, a single father working as a waiter at Maison d'Aurore, a cafe frequented by the financial elite. Years ago, he had been a technical manager at Roswell Group, but was fired after an electrical fire injured a female employee. His wife died of heart disease shortly after. He quit his career and raised his 7-year-old daughter Lily alone. She had the same congenital heart condition that had taken her mother. Their small apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building containing only a toy piano and an old family photo frame. Every morning, Lily sat by the window drawing pictures of people in uniforms, calling them ordinary heroes. That rainy morning, Daniel worked the early shift, unaware that Table 7 held a special guest. Isabella Ward, 33, CEO of Roswell Group, the woman who had signed his termination papers. She didn't recognize him. She only saw a quiet server with dark circles under his eyes bringing her coffee. As she positioned her pen to sign, a spark flashed from the outlet near the table. Without thinking, Daniel spilled the hot coffee to douse the electrical short. Papers soaked. Contract ruined. The client sat stunned. Isabella was furious. "Do you know you just destroyed a $3 million deal?" He only bowed his head. "If I hadn't, you would have been electrocuted." She fell silent, looking at the burn on his hand, something stirring in her chest. As he turned away, she noticed his name tag. Daniel H., a name sickeningly familiar. Years ago, there had been an electrical fire at Roswell. The report stated, "Technical error by Daniel Hayes." But Isabella had never investigated thoroughly. She had simply signed the termination to protect the company's image. Now she sat in this cafe, her life saved by the man she had destroyed, and she didn't know whether to feel grateful or ashamed. Daniel returned to the kitchen, running cold water over his burned wrist. The pain was sharp but manageable. He'd felt worse pain, the kind that comes from watching your wife die, the kind that comes from holding your daughter while she cries because her medication makes her sick. The cafe manager appeared angry. "What were you thinking? That's one of our biggest clients." The outlet was sparking. I saw it about to arc to her hand. She would have been badly hurt. The manager looked at the blackened outlet, then at Daniel's burned wrist, and his anger deflated. "Get that treated. Take 15 minutes. Daniel nodded and went to the small first aid kit they kept in the back. As he bandaged his wrist, he thought about the irony. Isabella Ward, the woman who had signed his termination without a second thought, who had never questioned whether the official story was true, who had chosen corporate protection over justice, and he had just saved her life. His phone buzzed, a text from Lily's school nurse. She had a dizzy spell during recess. "She's okay now, but you might want to pick her up early." Daniel closed his eyes. Every day was a balance between work and worry, between earning enough for her medication and being there when she needed him. He finished bandaging his wrist, pocketed his phone, and went back to the floor. Table 7 was empty. Isabella Ward had left, the ruined contract gathered in her briefcase. The coffee-stained papers a reminder of the morning's chaos. Daniel wiped down the table, checking the outlet one more time. It was still warm to the touch, still dangerous. He flagged it for the electrician and moved on to the next table. The next customer, the next moment in a life that had become an endless series of small emergencies and smaller victories. He didn't know that Isabella Ward sat in her car outside, staring at his name on the cafe's employee roster she'd pulled up on her phone, her hands shaking as memories flooded back. That afternoon, Isabella returned to the cafe and asked to speak with Daniel. "Do you remember me?" she asked. How could I forget the person who signed my termination papers? His voice was calm, almost gentle. The air froze. Only the sound of rain against the windows remained. Why did you still save me? She asked, genuinely confused. Because Lily needs a world where adults still save each other, even after hurting each other. She choked up, watching him open a tube of ointment and apply it to his burn. Your daughter? Yes, she has a heart condition. I work extra shifts to pay for her hospital bills. Isabella fell silent, remembering that day. The electrical fire at Roswell. The report that read, technical error by Daniel Hayes. But she had never investigated deeply, only signed to protect the company's image. Now the man she had destroyed had saved her life with his own burned hands. She visited the hospital where Lily was being treated, seeing a small, thin girl who still smiled constantly. Lily gave her a drawing. Uncle Daniel says adults just need to learn how to apologize sincerely and they'll be cured. Isabella laughed, tears falling uncontrollably. That night, Isabella retrieved the old files. She discovered the fire wasn't Daniel's fault at all. A subordinate had deliberately replaced electrical wiring with cheap alternatives to save budget money and pocket the difference. She gripped the files, her voice shaking. I destroyed an innocent man's life. The next morning, she returned to the cafe and handed Daniel an envelope. I want to make amends. He shook his head. I don't need money. I just need you to make sure no one else loses what I did. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Isabella kept returning to the cafe, not for meetings or business, but to see Daniel and through him, to see Lily. She learned that Daniel works 60-hour weeks, splitting his time between the cafe and night shifts at a warehouse. She learned that Lily needed surgery within the year, surgery that would cost more than Daniel could save in 5 years. She learned that he hadn't dated anyone since his wife died, pouring all his love into his daughter. And she learned that despite everything she had taken from him, he harbored no visible hatred. Only a quiet sadness and a fierce determination to give Lily the best life possible. One evening, Isabella offered to help with Lily's medical expenses. Daniel refused. Why? Isabella asked, frustrated. I owe you this. I owe you everything. You don't owe me money, Daniel said. You owe the truth. To yourself, to your company, to everyone who trusted you. That's worth more than any check you could write. The words hit her like a physical blow. He was right. Paying him off would ease her guilt, but changed nothing about the system that had crushed him in the first place. What should I do? She asked quietly. Start by finding out what really happened, then make sure it never happens again. Isabella began investigating. She dug through old records, interviewed former employees, followed paper trails that had been carefully buried. What she found made her sick. Victor Hale, the CFO, had been running a scheme for years. Cheap materials, falsified safety reports, kickbacks from contractors. The electrical fire that had been blamed on Daniel was the direct result of substandard wiring Victor had approved. And when Daniel had raised concerns before the fire, Victor had silenced him by having him transferred to a different project. Then, after the fire, Victor had ensured Daniel took the fall. Isabella had been so focused on quarterly earnings, on shareholder value, on her own rapid rise through the company, that she had never questioned the official story. She had trusted her team, and that trust had destroyed an innocent man. She sat in her office late one night, the evidence spread across her desk, and wept. For Daniel. For his wife, who had died believing her husband was a failure. For Lily, growing up without her mother and with a father broken by injustice. The next day she went to the cafe during Daniel's shift. The morning rush had ended, leaving the space quiet and intimate. I know what really happened, she said, sliding a folder across the table. Victor Hale caused the fire. You tried to stop it. You were the hero, and we made you the villain. Daniel looked at the documents but didn't touch them. What are you going to do about it? I don't know yet. Victor has powerful allies. The board protects him. If I accuse him without ironclad proof, he'll destroy me. So you'll stay silent again? The question wasn't accusatory. It was simply honest, and it cut deeper than any anger it could have. No, Isabella said firmly. I won't. I just need to be smart about how I do this. Will you help me? Daniel looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had unknowingly ruined his life, who was now trying to make it right, who had been brave enough to face him again and again, despite her shame. For Lily, he said finally, so she grows up in a world that's a little more just than the one I've lived in. Yes, I'll help. Isabella pulled out Lily's drawing from her briefcase, the one about adults learning to apologize. She had carried it with her every day since Lily gave it to her. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking, for what I did, for what I didn't do, for every assumption I made that destroyed your life. I'm so sorry. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. I believe you. Now, let's make sure sorry means something. The drawing went up on the cafe's community board where everyone who came in could see it. A child's wisdom, displayed for adults who had forgotten how to admit their mistakes. Word leaked that Roswell Group was being investigated for financial fraud. Victor Hale, the CFO, was the main target. He was also the man who years ago had replaced quality components with cheap alternatives to pocket the difference. Isabella was accused of being complicit. The media attacked. Fake CEO cries for public sympathy. She was devastated, with only Daniel still looking her in the eye. You can stand up, or you can keep hiding. I don't know where to start. Start with the truth. He helped her gather old files, emails that proved Victor had forged signatures and falsified reports. She went to the company, stood before a crowd of reporters, and announced her resignation while submitting the evidence against Victor. As she left the building, Victor's men cornered her in the parking garage. Daniel appeared, stepping in front of her. You don't need to do this, she said. I owe Lily a lesson about courage. A fight broke out. Daniel was hit, blood streaming from his cheek, but he held on to the USB drive containing the evidence. Police arrived. Victor was arrested. She helped Daniel to his feet, her voice breaking. Why am I always the one being saved? He smiled through the pain. Because you still have the ability to change. The confrontation in the parking garage had been brief but brutal. 3 of Victor's hired men, large and professional, against one waiter who hadn't been in a fight since high school. Daniel shouldn't have stood a chance, but he had something they didn't, absolute conviction. He was fighting for his daughter's future, for a world where people like Victor couldn't crush people like him with impunity. He was fighting because someone had to, and because Isabella, despite everything, deserved a chance to make things right. When the police pulled the men off him, Daniel was bleeding and bruised, but the USB drive was still clutched in his hand, unbroken. Isabella rode with him in the ambulance, holding pressure on the cut above his eye, her hands shaking. Why? She kept asking. Why would you risk yourself for me? Not for you, Daniel said, for what you can do, for the system you can change, for all the other Daniels who might come after me. At the hospital, while doctors stitched him up, Isabella made calls. To lawyers, to journalists, to board members she thought she could trust. By morning, the story was everywhere. CFO arrested, CEO whistleblower, years of corruption exposed. But the cost was evident. Roswell Group's stock plummeted. Thousands of employees faced uncertainty. Isabella's reputation, once sterling, was now complicated at best. Daniel found her in the hospital waiting room at 3 a.m., staring at her phone as notification after notification rolled in. Having second thoughts? He asked, his face bandaged. I destroyed thousands of lives today. Those employees, they did nothing wrong, and now they might lose their jobs because I exposed this. You didn't destroy those lives, Victor did. You're just the one brave enough to admit it happened. What if that's not enough? What if I made everything worse? Daniel sat beside her, wincing from his bruised ribs. My wife died thinking I was a failure, thinking I had caused that fire, that I had hurt someone. She died believing I was responsible, and I never got a chance to prove otherwise. That's the worst thing that ever happened to me. Not losing my job, not the poverty, the fact that she died with that doubt. He turned to face Isabella. But Lily will grow up knowing the truth now. She'll grow up knowing her father was brave, that he stood up for what was right. That's what matters. You've given her that gift, even if you didn't mean to. Isabella leaned against his shoulder, exhausted and terrified and strangely hopeful. What do we do now? Now we make sure the truth sticks, and then we build something better. Over the next week, as the investigation into Roswell Group intensified, Isabella and Daniel worked together. She provided insider knowledge, corporate documents, testimony. He provided the human story, the real-world consequences of corporate greed. Journalists ate it up. The narrative shifted from corrupt CEO to whistleblower with conscience, though Isabella knew the truth was messier than either label. Victor Hale was formally charged with the fraud, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment. 17 counts total. The evidence was overwhelming. But Isabella's career in corporate leadership was over. No major company would hire a CEO who had blown the whistle on her own board, regardless of how justified it was. She had chosen truth over power, and power didn't forgive that easily. Daniel found her one evening in the cafe, sitting alone after closing time. Lost? He asked gently. Completely. I don't know who I am if I'm not a CEO. I've been building toward that my entire adult life. Then maybe it's time to build toward something else, something that matters. Like what? Like making sure Lillian and all the kids like her get the medical care they need, regardless of whether their parents can afford it. Like making sure workers have real safety protections. Not just paperwork. Like taking everything you learned in the corporate world and using it to actually help people. Isabella looked at him, this man who had every reason to hate her, but instead kept offering her a path forward. I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said. Maybe not, Daniel agreed. But you're earning it. Every day, you're earning it. He pulled out a small velvet box from his pocket, but instead of a ring, it contained her old CEO identification card, the one that had fallen in the parking garage fight. It was cracked, water-stained, trampled. I kept this, he said, to remind myself that symbols of power are just plastic and laminate. They break easy. What matters is what you do when they break. Isabella took the broken ID card and looked at her own face staring back at her, the woman she used to be. I don't want to be her anymore, she whispered. Good, Daniel said, because the world needs who you're becoming instead. 1 month later, Roswell Group collapsed completely. The media called Isabella the righteous whistleblower. Isabella left the city and found her way to the small apartment where Daniel and Lily lived. She knocked. Lily opened the door and shouted with joy, "Coffee, lady!" All three sat at the small table eating a simple dinner of noodles, vegetables, and laughter. Isabella began teaching Lily piano while Daniel helped her fix the old windows. The room gradually filled with light. One afternoon at the park, while Lily played on the swings, Isabella said, I want to start a foundation for children with heart conditions. What do you think about calling it the Lily Foundation? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Think you're learning how to choose your life again. She smiled, her eyes warming. That evening, Lily asked, Are you two getting married? Isabella laughed. If we're not ready, we'll just wait. And Daniel replied, We'll wait until she stops being afraid of getting dirty from coffee. They laughed together, yellow lamplight spilling through the window. The transformation happened slowly. Isabella sold her penthouse apartment, her luxury car, her designer wardrobe. She kept only what she needed and converted everything else into seed money for the foundation. She moved into a modest apartment near Daniel and Lily, close enough to be part of their daily lives, but far enough to maintain appropriate boundaries. She was, after all, still learning how to be a person instead of a position. The Lily Foundation launched quietly, without press releases or grand announcements. Just a small office, a dedicated staff of 3, and a mission to provide financial assistance to families dealing with pediatric heart conditions. Isabella threw herself into the work with the same intensity she'd once applied to quarterly earnings reports. But now, instead of profit margins, she measured success in surgeries funded, in families kept together, and children who got to keep being children instead of medical cases. Daniel watched her transformation with quiet approval. She would arrive at their apartment covered in paint from helping renovate the foundation's office, or exhausted from a day of meeting with donors, or frustrated by the bureaucratic tangles of nonprofit administration. And every time, she seemed more real, more human, more herself than he'd ever seen her in those early cafe encounters. One Saturday, as they walked through a farmer's market with Lily between them, the little girl holding both their hands, Daniel realized something had shifted. He no longer saw Isabella as the woman who had signed his termination papers. He saw her as the woman who had chosen to destroy her own career rather than perpetuate injustice, as the woman who showed up for his daughter every week with piano lessons and patience, as the woman who had learned to apologize not just with words but with her entire life. "Thank you," he said suddenly. Isabella looked at him, confused. For what? For showing Lily that people can change, that making a mistake doesn't mean you're defined by it forever. She needs to see that, especially when her own life feels so fragile sometimes. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. She's teaching me as much as I'm teaching her. Lily tugged on both their hands. "Can we get ice cream, please?" They got ice cream. They sat on a park bench watching ducks on a pan, sticky fingers and simple joy. And for the first time since his wife died, Daniel felt something like peace. That night, after Lily was asleep, Isabella and Daniel sat on the small balcony of his apartment. The city lights spread below them. "I never thought my life would look like this," Isabella said. "A year ago, I was flying first class to board meetings, wearing $1,000 suits, making decisions that moved millions of dollars. And now I'm here, eating noodles in a fifth-floor walk-up, and I've never been happier." "No regrets?" "Only that it took me so long to wake up. Only that I hurt you before I learned better." She turned to face him. "Do you think you'll ever fully forgive me?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I think forgiveness isn't a destination. It's a direction. And every day I choose to move in that direction. Some days it's easy. Some days I still feel angry about what I lost. But then I see what we're building now, and I think maybe it was all necessary to get here." "That's very wise." "I've had a lot of time to think about it. Late nights in the cafe, watching rich people make deals while I cleaned up their messes. You either get bitter or you get philosophical." Isabella laughed softly. "I'm glad you chose philosophical." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the city, a gentle background hum. Inside, Lily was safe and sleeping, her breathing steady, her heart monitored by medication and love. "The foundation is officially registered," Isabella said. "We can start accepting applications next month." "That's fast." "I learned how to move quickly in the corporate world. Turns out those skills are useful for good things too." Daniel smiled. "Redemption through efficiency. Your corporate trainers would be so proud." "They'd be horrified," Isabella corrected, "but I don't care anymore." And in that moment, Daniel believed her completely. 6 months later, the Lilly Foundation officially opened, helping children with heart disease. At the grand opening, Isabella spoke. "Sometimes a spilled cup of coffee is fate's way of helping us wash away our mistakes." She looked down at the front row where Daniel and Lily sat, clapping enthusiastically. After the ceremony, she approached him. "If you two still need someone to make coffee, I'd like to stay." He smiled. "Welcome home." That evening, they worked together to transform the small cafe where it all began into Lily's Cafe, a place for wounded people to start over. Lily painted a sign for the door. "Sorry, coffee may spill, but kindness never does." Yellow light illuminated the tables. The scent of coffee rose in thin, sweet wisps. Isabella sat down across from Daniel and said softly, "Family isn't where you're born. It's where you choose to be every single day." He replied, "And I choose you again, every morning since I spilled that cup of coffee." The evening rush had ended. Lily's Cafe was quiet except for the soft jazz playing through old speakers and the sound of the espresso machine cooling down. Daniel wiped down the counter while Isabella counted the register. They had been open for 2 weeks, and already the cafe had become something special. Not because of the coffee, though Daniel had learned to make an excellent cappuccino, but because of the atmosphere. They had made it a space where people could sit without pressure to buy more, to leave, to perform. The walls were covered in Lily's drawings and drawings from other children at the hospital. Local artists displayed their work for free. A bulletin board near the door listed job opportunities, community resources, and weekly support group meetings. It was the cafe Isabella had wished existed during her darkest days, a place that served coffee but specialized in kindness. Lily emerged from the back room where she'd been doing homework. "Are we going home now?" Almost, sweetheart. Just finishing up. The girl climbed onto a stool and watched her father work. Dad, do you think Mom would have liked this cafe? Daniel paused, his hand still on the towel. I think she would have loved it, and I think she'd be so proud of you. And Miss Isabella too? Yes, Miss Isabella too. Isabella looked up from the register, emotion tightening her throat. In 6 months, she had somehow become part of this small family. Not as a replacement for Daniel's late wife, but as something new and unexpected. A friend, a partner, maybe eventually something more. But for now, this was enough. These quiet evenings, this meaningful work, this little girl who had taught her more about courage than any business school ever could. I have an idea, Lily announced. We should have a special drink called the Second Chance Latte. Isabella laughed. What would be in it? Coffee, obviously, and cinnamon, and chocolate, and magic. Magic. Daniel raised an eyebrow. The magic of being nice to people even when they're not nice first. The adults exchanged glances, struck once again by the wisdom that came from this small person. I think that's a perfect idea, Isabella said. We'll add it to the menu tomorrow. Later, after closing, after Lily had fallen asleep on the cafe's couch waiting for them to finish, Daniel and Isabella stood together looking at the space they had created. The sign Lily had painted hung above the counter. Coffee may spill, but kindness never does. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spilled that coffee? Isabella asked. Every day, Daniel admitted. And every day I'm grateful I did. Not just because it saved your life, because it saved mine too. Gave me something to live for besides just surviving. I love you, Isabella said suddenly, surprising them both. I don't know when it happened, but I do. I love you and Lily, and this ridiculous cafe, and this whole beautiful mess we've created. Daniel turned to her, his expression soft. I love you too. Have for a while now. Just didn't know if I was allowed to say it. You're allowed. You're always allowed. They kissed there, surrounded by coffee beans and children's artwork, two broken people who had learned how to heal each other. Lily stirred on the couch. Finally, she mumbled, half asleep. I thought you'd never figure it out. They laughed, the sound echoing through the small space that had become their sanctuary, their second chance, their home. Outside, rain began to fall, just like it had that morning 6 months ago, when everything changed with one spilled cup of coffee. But inside, in the warm glow of Lily's cafe, there was only light and laughter and love. The kind of love that's earned through forgiveness, the kind that's built on honesty and sustained by choosing each other again and again, every single day. Family isn't where you're born. It's where you choose to stay. And they had all chosen here. If you believe that healing stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Strong Dad Stories. We tell the stories that should never be forgotten.